Awesome. Okay, let's get started, folks. Tomorrow, what I'll get you to do is, if anyone joins late, can you let them in?
Of course.
But whilst you've got your camera on, everyone, this is Tamara, my wonderful co-host.
Hello,
I'm
everyone.
going to be leading this session today, but Tamara is going to be doing an equally wonderful job in just a short while. Is it the 14th?
The 15th.
15th.
Yeah.
15th. Tune in then. So I'm going to be mostly covering filmmaking as a visual medium. And then Tamara will be going over photography.
That's right.
So yeah, that should be great. In the meanwhile, let's get Shifty on. Introductions. We've already started this actually, whilst people were waiting and naming the songs and saying their favourite animals. So we won't spend too long at this. What I will do is introduce myself, because that I haven't done. And appropriately, given we're talking about filmmaking and creating change, I am going to let my video self introduce me. So we'll test video's bandwidth and Zoom's capabilities. Let me know if this goes horribly wrong.
My name is Elliot Connor, and I am 18. I live in the land down under, Australia, the sunburnt country. In my youth, I learned through collecting coins, rocks and minerals, shells and insects, instruments, feathers and elements of the periodic table. I learned through taking things apart and experimenting. But it was my travels and adventures in nature that hooked me. I found purpose in creating new narratives about science, conservation, and technology. I'm a filmmaker, presenter, podcaster, author, and animal rescuer. An eco-warrior and thought leader. I founded a charity that supports environmental volunteers and then scaled it across 100 countries. I found hope in my fellow young leaders and in sharing nature's wonder. My life has been incredible, and I'm thankful to have had such opportunity. Now I want to repay that debt, bringing people and animals together.
Awesome. Well, Zoom almost managed that. I appreciate it was a bit jumpy for some people. I will try and make these slides available to you anyway, and you can always look that up online if you want to go over it later. Bottom line is, I love filmmaking. I love what I do. At heart, I'm a science communicator, but I come from a quite heavy conservation background. So hence the merging of these two. And I mean, throughout the history of wildlife filmmaking, from the days of Attenborough onwards, it has been very closely connected, that entire industry, to conservation work, to environmentalism. So there really are some very, very powerful synergies between the two. And of course, this is the age of visual mediums like this. This is the age of the smartphone, the television, all these online streaming services, which we will get into in further detail later. But that gives all of us working in this field an incredibly powerful tool to be able to motivate people to advocate for change and to communicate the incredible work we're doing. Because, I mean, I have worked long enough in the environmental space to know how amazing the stories that come out of it are. So, yeah, I genuinely believe there is so much value to be learned from today's discussion, and I definitely don't intend it to be a one-sided debate. So anyone who has a question, please chuck it in the chat at any point. Tomorrow we'll be monitoring them, and we will pause for Q&A. We'll have a break at an hour, so we'll pause then, and just before the 2-hour mark as well. So that gives plenty of time to chat about anything we've gone over. But yeah, I mean, I have progressed over the course of the past few years. I started out more in photography, moved on to podcasting. As you can see, that's my first book on the slide. So I have done some in the written medium as well, but filmmaking has been my long-term passion. So that's where I'm working today. So without further ado, the presentation I'm going to deliver today has two parts. We'll split it by the hour. The first part is more theoretical. Why filmmaking? Why do we use it? What's the power it has? And yeah, why bother, essentially? So really important to have that grounding knowledge. So once we can talk the talk, then you guess what comes next? We walk the walk. So this is all the technicalities, so that you can actually do what we're talking about. You can create a wildlife film about XYZ cause. We won't go too technical, so don't worry about that. If you do have some experience in this field, that's great, but it won't be over any of your heads. I guarantee it. So I really wanted to start off with this quote, and hopefully you can read it. It says, "When we look at nature, we see ourselves." It's one I use time and again because it is dead on right. It's very pertinent. The reason we love wildlife documentaries, and they are a hugely burgeoning field, is that we can resonate with other animals, that we empathize with them, that we recognize them as sentient, intelligent, living creatures. And yeah, increasingly so with modern day science, we're being able to recognize that isn't just sentimental values, that really is what these animals are doing. It's not anthropomorphism, as the jargon goes, but the really important thing to keep in mind when we're doing any sort of filmmaking with animals as characters, essentially, is not to deprive them of that right. They are more human than we acknowledge. So that's point one where I'd like to start at. And as we'll see as we go through this presentation, that has been increasingly recognized in the industry and by especially conservation stakeholders creating these sorts of products. So we have a few examples, and I mean, I picked these pretty much arbitrarily, but we are surrounded by animals day in, day out, whether we classify them as nature, which is an argument in itself. The point is that even in cities, I'm in Sydney, so in pure urban landscapes, we do have nature all around us, and pigeons are a great example of that. Second point being that we are much more likely to look favourably on animals that we have day-to-day experiences with. So you can see the cats in the second picture along. It's obvious that we're much more likely to look fondly upon our own pets. That's why we keep them, because they show loyalty, they show gratitude. We enjoy having that connection to another living creature. And the same applies to a lesser extent with pigeons, which do get a bit of a bad rap. But as some of you may know, actually, during both the World Wars, I believe, pigeons were used quite extensively in military operations. They received dozens of service medals. So you have the whole generation that actually grew up with them, potentially having saved their lives. So there are animals which we come to respect. There are animals which are villainized in our contemporary society, but all of them we can learn to love. And you can see the third picture there is a koala. I'm in Australia, so I chose a koala, but koalas are funny animals to look at from a filmmaking perspective, because they are absolutely inanimate. They do nothing all day. It's something like 20 hours sleeping. They feed on a very low energy diet. So whenever you find one in a zoo or in the wild, all it's going to do is sit cling to a tree. There is absolutely no reason why we should come to like these animals. They're essentially like rocks, very rocks in trees. But yeah, we do. And the point is, some animals we find cute. Some animals we are very likely to come to appreciate just for that factor. So there are different perspectives, different approaches. And the point I'm trying to make is when we're looking at creating a film, for whatever reason, and we'll look at some of the different reasons we may be using this skill a bit later on, but whatever we're trying to achieve with it, we're trying to make an audience empathize with another animal, most certainly. That's what environmentalism is about at its core. So if it's a cute animal, and koalas embody this like nothing else, being inanimate objects, but being insanely cute. They have the same head to body ratio as a 3-month-old child, which studies have shown cause that almost maternal instinct. So they naturally cause us to like them. So that'd be a very easy subject to broach with that path. Whereas for a pigeon, what you're trying to do is create a narrative. You're trying to create a story around it, about perhaps it's heroism in this case, where it's saved people's lives, or in the case of the cats, you're showing they're intelligent creatures. You're going to be showing some of their extraordinary feats, lacking 9 lives, but having decent brains. And with the chickens, you can see in the bottom of the screen, the point is around animal language. It's not necessarily verbal, it's not in English, certainly. I mean, increasingly, we are being able to decode animals' languages, but even animals that don't communicate vocally have so much language in their body posture. So humans are very good at being able to interpret that. Again, scientific literature shows that we can almost always tell when an animal is sad, or when an animal is hungry, or when it's angry. So one of the very common mistakes to make in a wildlife film is to try and guide an audience too much. Picture speaks 1,000 words, and we'll look briefly at music and voiceovers, but the bottom line is that you don't need to say it. If an audience is going to work it out, don't. When you go through an Attenborough script, he never speaks at more than 120 words per minute. Never, ever. That's very slow. He is speaking as little as humanly possible, especially in the works he produced, instead of ones he's just doing voiceover for, so in which he didn't write the script. But if you look at classic Attenborough, some of his older shows, you'll notice he's essentially trying to blend into the background, trying to guide you as little as possible, whilst making sure you still take away as much as you can from this experience. So that's what we're trying to do, craft a narrative. Speaking of which, I've got a little game to play with you all. So if you'll humour me, what I'll do is I will push on one slide. And if you've got a piece of paper in front of you, what you can do is you can draw down these boxes in roughly some sort of grid out there. Otherwise, you can just concentrate on the screen. What we're going to play is a memory game used on chimpanzees. So in case you didn't believe my ramblings about animals being intelligent, complex, fascinating characters to capture by film, we're going to put it to the test. So this is actually a computer program designed by researchers at Kyoto University. They have a group of resident chimpanzees housed in a beautiful sanctuary, surroundings there, and they come in for daily testing at this little game. How it works is they see the numbers 1 to 9 on a screen in front of them. All they have to do is press them in order, but when the number 1 is clicked, all the others disappear. So I'm going to turn back to the screen with all the numbers on, and I'll give you, I'll be generous, I'll give you 5 seconds to memorize them all. And then we'll see how you go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you've written it down, put down the boxes, and then see how you go filling it out. Otherwise, try and trace your finger along the route, 1 to 9 on the screen. If you manage it, you put so in the chat. Some people probably should balance the probability. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. You should get at least a 6, then it becomes really difficult, and there's a large amount of guesswork involved. No one's managed it thus far. Tut tut. You need to practice. There we go. 2 people have got it. Very good. There's the original. Perfect. So yeah, the point is the chimpanzees at the sanctuary, there's one of them in particular called Ayumu. He does this in literally the time it takes to blink. He memorizes them all, and then he can type into the screen. He doesn't get 5 seconds, so you played the easy version of the game, but he gets it right, like 95% of the time. He's unnervingly accurate and brilliant in his short-term memory. So this is something that came out relatively recently, a number of years ago. But yeah, I find it a lovely demonstration of abilities that some would find surprising in animals, that they can beat humans so readily at a game like that. And Ayumu was actually put to the test against world memory champions. He beat them time and again. He is much better than a human could be. So that just puts things in perspective. And I think humility is important when we're crafting stories as well, which I will get you to approach later in the presentation. But yeah, trying to find a unique approach, which we'll talk about more. So if you arrived early, you may have heard I've just come back from an expedition to the Great Barrier Reef. And I thought, given I'm giving a presentation about visual mediums, I thought I'd share a few of my photos. But I mean, the point I'm trying to make here is it's not hard to take decent photos, to make decent videos. It doesn't take expensive gear. All of those photos were taken on a $200 camera. So that is probably unnecessary, even at that level. But when you have access to these animals, and environmentalists do more than anyone else in the world, more than filmmaking crews that fly out to Uganda to film the gorillas. If you talk to the conservation organizations working on the ground, if you talk to the rangers, then they ultimately are the people who make wildlife films happen. So I think we are very, very privileged in the position that we are in. And with just a bit of knowledge, with a bit of training, there is so much you can get out of it in terms of simply raising awareness about your cause. I have trawled through far too many websites of environmental organizations that are written in like 1980s pre-internet with blurred out black and white photos of a far off animal. I've actually got some examples I'll share with you later in the presentation, but it makes such a big difference when a donor can visualize what the cause is you're talking about. And obviously, the financial aspect is crucial to keeping an environmental operation going, or if you're reapplying for a grant, if you're simply trying to attract volunteers, if you're trying to do a press release, get out into the news. All of these will require good quality visual assets. So content creation is an essential 21st century skill. And I'm going to try and help you master it. So this is some more of the background. I mentioned earlier, we're living in this golden age of opportunity. It's the golden age of television, often quoted. We have a really interesting industry that's rapidly changing, springing out, especially in this wildlife capture space. And I see is that Nivedita that's just asked the question, what equipment do I use? That's part 2. So you can hold on to that question. But yeah, feel free to keep the questions coming. What I was saying around the time we're living in, even with COVID come up, that's a great new opportunity. It's been a double-edged sword. It means that for those who specialize in wildlife filmmaking, they have not been able to get out to these remote locations. They've not been able to continue the production process per se. But it also means that you have, I think it's 1 billion more users on Instagram. You've had all the streaming platforms rocket up in usership. There's billions you can reach through these networks. If you look at the next slide, 2 out of 3 people in the world have some sort of phone. They have access to the internet, which means they are able to access any content you produce. If you upload it, say, to YouTube or to Vimeo, or if you upload it to Netflix, all of these democratize filmmaking to an incredible degree. And from inside the industry, what's happening is you're getting the rise of independent producers and production companies. Whereas in good old Attenborough's days, and you can count the number of times I say his name in this presentation, it would be at least a dozen. But when he was creating this industry, it was a monopoly for the BBC. They set up base in London, eventually out in Bristol. That has since become the national heart and international centre of the industry. But they are no longer the only player, and they are by no means the most important player even in this industry anymore. If you've watched any of the recent Attenborough films, A Life on Our Planet or Our Planet, films like that, they were actually produced by other companies than the BBC. So there is a lot of opportunity. You don't need expensive equipment. You can reach an incredible viewership. The key takeaways thus far. It's really surprising how few people realize this. I was on a conversation with some board members of Research Foundation out on the Reef just a few days ago. And they were looking at starting an online presence. So doing some video content, accessing social media. And they saw it as a burden, as like almost a duty of responsibility. Like you have to do it to appear like you're a with it organization. You're moving with the times, you're not a bunch of 70-year-olds, no matter how true that may be. but there is so much to be gained from it. It's not a burden. It's an incredible opening that has been proven to create change. So, I mean, at this point, I would love to take you through some case studies just to prove that point. And the obvious one to start with is Planet Earth 2. So if you haven't seen this yet, no spoilers, but shame on you. And you definitely need to. You can access it, I'm sure, on many of the streaming platforms. You can access it on the BBC iPlayer, I'm sure. So definitely take a watch at that. It is, I believe, to date, the most successful wildlife film ever produced. It had instant following, something like 12 million at each of its debut screenings on TV that tuned in the UK. So incredibly popular. But yeah, I mean, it's not without controversy. There are some which we'll look into slightly later. But I mean, one of the really interesting questions that was raised, certainly in the scientific literature and also somewhat in conservation circles following its release, was how great was the impact it had? And this is really interesting to look at if we're approaching wildlife filmmaking, because if we're going to go to all the trouble of making a film, and trust me, Planet Earth was a marathon to make. It was 5 years, 6 years, I believe, in production. Hundreds of terabytes of footage, something like 500 days in the field equivalent by so many cameramen. So incredible amount of effort that went into it. But yeah, how do you measure its impact? And if you are looking at this from the perspective of an environmental organization, you have to be asking those questions. How do you monitor its impacts? So there have been some studies that looked into this. We've got obvious methods. You can look at a site like Google Analytics. You can look at Google Trends data. So that will show you the number of searches for a given animal. So say, obviously, iguanas prominently featured in Planet Earth 2. If you look at iguana searches on Google pre and post the release of Planet Earth 2, and whilst it was having a popularity spike, you'll see the same thing in the species it stars. So it's really interesting how these shows can create impact. What the controversy was about with Planet Earth 2 is whether that impact lasted. So this is a really big consideration to come into play. I mean, you can look at it from a merely corporate viewpoint. You're saying the BBC is just out there to make money, which historically has been more the case. And Planet Earth 2 took an incredible budget to make, but it also made even more. So it succeeded from that standpoint. But where it didn't clearly make such an impact is in donations to environmental organizations, in volunteering spikes. So there was no obvious long-term impact from a show like that, successful as it was. And what I would love to talk about, if we get time, is this emerging field of impact producing, as it's called, trying to make sure that any film, any program that we end up creating then reflects back well and creates some tangible benefits for the organization that made it or the organization that featured in it. So whilst it's all well and good people being more interested in iguanas, say, looking them up in Google, perhaps reading a Wikipedia article, what would be even better, and what is increasingly being done, again in this field, is trying to raise awareness about pertinent environmental issues. So historically, with blue chip documentaries such as Planet Earth 2, what has been done has been just to tie in a bit of environmental rhetoric at the end. Sometimes it's in the last episode, Sometimes it's 5 minutes at the end of each episode, but regardless, you're not incorporating it throughout, and it's a really difficult balance to maintain. We'll talk more about the narrative structure later, but yeah, it's really important to be able to maintain clarity in your messaging while showing the natural world at its best. So that's great, but you also have to make sure you're not going down the other extreme, which is just desensitizing the audience, slamming home message after message about birds having plastic filling their stomachs and turtles eating plastic bags that look like jellyfish, and climate change is going to murder us all and we're all going to die in 20 years. Whatever your future projections might look like, whatever your current course you're working towards is, people need a story to connect with it. So the challenge is finding a story that tells an important message, is what we're looking at when we're creating a film. That's a really key takeaway, keep in mind. And then the third part of that is if we can then link that message to a very clear action a viewer can take. So you will have noticed with lots of the more recent high budget documentaries, certainly, but also some of the more low budget ones that are coming out now, is that they'll always end or they'll always be tied to an impact campaign. So they may have an end to camera bit or an end screen which says visit lifeonourplanet.org, where you can find out more about what we talked about in this show. And that will give you links to the environmental organizations it talks about. That will give you links to learn more about these causes, but also to contribute to them. So really clear messaging and really clear actionable goals, a call to action to end with the CTA. So yeah, that's a really interesting case study to look at. We've got a few more, so I'll make sure we get through them. This is a slightly more recent one. So Planet Earth 2 was 2016, I believe. My Octopus Teacher was last year. And yeah, as you may have heard, it's been nominated for an Oscar. Incredibly successful. It's swept all of the film awards across multiple festivals, and it is doing that because it is a really powerful story. So if you haven't watched it, you definitely need to, because it is absolutely golden standard for how you can make an audience invested in an animal character. We'll talk about issues with wildlife filmmaking later. One of the obvious ones being that animals don't follow cues. They don't follow scripts. Really, really hard to make them play along to your story. But My Octopus Teacher creates a narrative nevertheless via a human-animal interaction. So definitely check that out. But yeah, I was speaking with its producer a few months back, Ellen Windmuth, and what she was saying, which really resonated actually, was that this narrative, this story, arose almost unexpectedly. So Craig Foster, who, as you may know, features in it, and who's the protagonist of this story, was really struggling with his life, with personal issues, challenges, before he took this incredible journey. And you can watch The Octopus Teacher to find out how that unfolds. But that really turned things around for him. So you have that character arc, which again we'll talk about. And you also have that powerful narrative with an animal. So that's the key takeaway. When we're trying to create wildlife films, it doesn't only have to be wildlife. You can have people. And I can never, ever say this enough, especially if we're tackling this from the viewpoint of an environmental organization. You're the ones doing the work, so take the credit for it, definitely. People are fine with animals. Some are easier to connect with. If it's a tardigrade, then that can be quite difficult to resonate with. Microscopic water bear. So if it's a koala, great, chuck it on the screen, give it lots of airtime, but make sure you have a human element as well. So when you have, say, an Attenborough figure doing a voiceover, he will always try and appear on screen at least once or twice throughout the show to make sure the audience knows he's a person. Frequently, it will be for the introduction part. So it will be saying, oh, this is planet Earth, 7 continents and lots of species, and it's all great. That's brilliant. It lets the audience see who he is, lets them start empathizing with him. They're more likely to listen, etc., etc. And Attenborough is a celebrity, so that helps as well. But the point is, if you have a person telling the narrative, then that allows you to create a compelling story that allows you to get your audience interested, even if they don't care about animals one bit. So my octopus teacher has a perennial appeal. Nobody cares that it also has an animal in. It doesn't have to be a sitcom with only people. It's allowed to do that because it has that human element. So definitely consider that as well. Here's an interesting case study. It's one which, again, I came across relatively recently. And again, I was speaking with the creative mastermind behind this project, which, as you'll see, was in virtual reality. So it was created by a firm called Habitat XR, and it was incredibly successful, created for a fundraising event by the Ellen Fund, so an environmental organization, stakeholder working in gorilla conservation. Brilliant that they're doing that. Even more brilliant that they're able to show it. And because it's a great ape, that instantly makes it a great animal character to put on screen. Brilliant to be able to empathize with. And doing it in VR makes it immersive. So don't discount emerging technologies. The challenge you get with something like VR is distribution. With an event like this, it was an in-person gathering. You had people, I don't know, it was a ball or a sit-down meal or a formal dinner, whatever it was, you had people gathering in one space. You could have a few headsets. You could show it on big screen, surrounding projectors. However you end up playing it, that's relatively easy. If you're trying to distribute to an international audience, or if you're trying to, say, do it across a series of school workshops, then you run into a few challenges. And there are solutions to that. There are ones used by other VR filmmakers. They made Immerse, is what it's called, which is an ocean VR program. And it's like a deep dive and it's immersible, showing how the ocean changes as you descend. What they did to essentially prototype this film and its distribution was use very cheap, like sort of Google Cardboard equivalents, really low-tech, lo-fi headsets that could either have a very simple 360-degree image printed on them, or you could have a phone put in there as a Google Cardboard would. That would then allow you to turn full 360, have essentially that experience. So 360 filming is as straightforward as it gets. You're going right down to the roots. You cannot control an audience's viewpoint. They're turning around, spinning in circles, or they may be feeling sick and vomiting in the trash bin. You don't know. So it creates essentially a chance for human to get into a habitat with an animal. Can be really powerful, and it has proven to be in experiences like this, and also not too costly. With all of these emerging technologies like 3D printing and AR, VR, whatever it may be, the price is falling exponentially, like sustainable energy equivalent, really sharp drop. So this is, again, entry level kit costs, talking a few $100s to get a 360 camera nowadays. If you mount that on a bush, on a rock, chuck it in with some gorillas, and then this is when you get real impact. And that fundraiser managed to now raise millions. Really successful. So the last case study is one I was actually directly involved with. It's talking about a company called Wild Earth TV. Again, check them out if you haven't heard of them. What they do is very different to any of these case studies. They are streaming live safaris for 6 hours a day from a few locations across Africa. There are disadvantages and there are very strong advantages to it. Disadvantages being it's hellish stressful. This was actually my first filmmaking position, believe it or not. So you definitely have a sharp learning curve. And obviously when the camera breaks in the field, we're doing off-road forward driving, so that does happen, then you either have to switch to a backup vehicle, which fortunately they have at least 2 or 4 running at once, or then your stream goes black if you don't have a backup. So live visual events, live visual presentations, live streaming is very high risk, but it's also very high reward. So Wild Earth does an incredible service in what it delivers to its audience base. It's streaming authentic content. It's not 5 years edited into a few hours worth of videos, as in Planet Earth 2. This is 3 hours of filming makes 3 hours of content. So it gives people a very real, very raw experience. It allows them to ask questions directly of the, in this case, the presenter on the front of the vehicle, who's a trained field guide, a naturalist. And yeah, that allows them to create an incredible educational experience. They also run a similar live stream for schools that they can tap into, private sessions where all the kids just, the only people asking questions like, why do elephants have trunks and whatever crazy questions to think of. But it's really difficult what they do. They have been doing it for a few decades now, so they have it down to a T. But it's also really powerful. So in a case where you're looking for a step up from a set piece film, that is where you can go, either to an emerging technology like virtual reality, or to more of a live content feed. So there are some platforms you may be aware of, like explore.org, like Zooniverse, that are able to compile, in some cases, live feeds from remote cameras, in other cases, photos from remote triggered cameras, so trail cameras in pristine wilderness that people can just access. Just click away on the internet, which is one of the really powerful elements of the age we're living in. It's not only the golden age of television, it's the golden age of accessible information and accessible experiences. It really is a small world we're living in with the way technology is going. So yeah, a few things to keep in mind. There's so many different ways you can approach using these visual mediums. And in the case of Wild Earth, they get 1 million viewers tune in every month. So it definitely builds up a significant audience base. And because essentially you're having a live conversation with presenters, with these field guides, they are able to really connect with the audience. They're able to deliver very powerful messages about environmental causes. They're able to answer your questions about how to live sustainably in a green manner. So that, I guess, it takes out the middleman, and it takes out an element of uncertainty in terms of how a program will be received. Because if you do have a set piece 30-minute documentary, then you're not able to control somewhat your viewer impression of it. So having more of a human element they have to sympathize unless they're some sort of psychopath. So that's just another reason why you need to make sure you have animals, definitely, but humans as well. So keep that in mind. Which almost brings us to the hour mark. So what I will do is I will open it up to questions. And if you do need to rush off to the bathroom, if you do need to get a drink, now is the time. But I'll leave 10 minutes to answer any questions you may have midway about anything. If I'm going to cover it in the next hour, I probably won't answer it just yet, but shoot away anything you have. And okay. I will take a look as well.
Okay, so I copied all the questions in the chat, so I can read them to you to make it easier, if that's okay.
Shoot away.
Okay, so Faye Bogley asked, the images used are great. Who are they by?
All of the images in that collage were by me. Some of these on white background are stock images, but all of the videos and most of the photos are mine.
Okay, great. Jamie asked, where would you draw the line when making a nature film about animals so it shows the beauty of nature, then making them compared to the nature of people?
Oh, that's a really difficult one. You see, because when you start trying to, I guess, analyze humans as well, you start getting into very dangerous territory in terms of how a show will be received. We are humans. So if you start criticizing humans, that's when you get into this realm, which is a very common trap nowadays of people switching off, people stopping to listen, stopping caring about whatever it is you're talking about. Not to put too fine a point on it, you have to be very, very subtle in how you deliver messages, even if humans are wrecking the planet, which I don't doubt to be the case. If you can tell, say, in the story of an octopus, climate change is causing their ocean to acidify. It's causing there to be less dissolved oxygen in the water. And that is affecting all marine life, but in the case of octopuses and many other marine creatures, a lesser concentration of dissolved oxygen actually impairs their sight when it reaches a certain level. So you're causing them to go slowly blind, which, think about it, is quite horrific. So if you can tell a story about an octopus slowly going blind because you're flying on a weekly commute, then that's much more powerful than saying that everyone's going to die because you're going on a weekly commute. So it's about linking it back to something people can empathize with without casting humans too strongly as the villain. And actually, in the book I showed you earlier, this one I wrote last year, what I do in great detail is analyze how we portray the human character with respect to other animals. I come to the conclusion that humans, at a very basic level, are opportunistic ecosystem engineers. We're thrifty troublemakers. So what we do is we are very, very adept at changing the spaces around us, the environments we live in, like a beaver. So if you look at, let's say, a case like Yellowstone, Yellowstone National Park, first national park, formerly created in America, huge sweeping natural expanse. Very famously, when you had the wolves being exterminated within that national park, it caused what's called a trophic cascade. So affected all the other animals in the ecosystem, amongst them the beavers. So there were less beavers because of that disappearance. And when they reintroduced the wolves, you had beavers rebound. You had, I think it was a dozen of them come in to the national park within a decade or within a few years. So that was a really fast recovery. And what it caused was the rivers actually changed their path. They became more winding, which creates new habitat spaces, which allows more aquatic animals to come and reside. Hence famous claim that wolves change the course of the rivers. So that's actually how it panned out. And what humans are doing is the same thing on a larger scale. Like the beavers, we're creating new structures. In the beavers' case, it's dams. In humans' case, it's cities and farms and skyscrapers, which create new habitats, yes, but they can also affect other animals. That may be in a positive way, that may be in a negative way. So there are winners and there are losers. It's important to be open-minded about that. So something like a pigeon is definitely a winner, or a peregrine falcon in Manhattan, which is diving off skyscrapers. It loves it up there. Very safe perch, brilliant vantage point for hunting. But what you're doing is you're tipping the balance. You're changing which species are successful. So one thing I talk about a lot when I'm speaking is the sort of new normal, and comparing that to what we call conservation and restoration, all of these ideas about trying to return back to some previous state. When are you looking back to? Is it pre-industrial era? Is it 100 years ago? When is peak nature? Because it's one, damnably difficult to get back there, and two, it's just not how we should be approaching this. It's inefficient, it's resource heavy, and it's going against nature itself. Nature adapts, it changes. That's evolution for you. So what humans are doing is changing the way that evolution pans out in ecosystems, and we're benefiting from it ultimately, hence the opportunistic part.
Okay, great. Shanmuga Sundara asks, what could be the proportion or ratio of spoken words and visuals in a visual production?
Good question. It depends what you're trying to do with the production. So you can have productions with absolutely no voiceovers at all. You can have it with just words on the screen. That's fine. I'll actually show you one of those later on, just after this break. But the most commonly used balance we see is in these so-called blue chip documentaries, landmark productions, where you're having a few sentences accompanying each of the scenes we see. And you notice are even trends within that. So in more recent productions, we're getting more voiceovers, which I personally disagree with. I think it makes them less impactful, but it is nevertheless the case. And yeah, the figure I quoted earlier was quite accurate. 120 words per minute is an upper threshold for what Attenborough can do. So use that as a standard. When I'm speaking, for example, that would be something like 180 words per minute. So if you're trying to gauge it with that sort of method, then yeah, take those two points into consideration. You're definitely not going to be speaking as much as, say, I would giving a presentation, or you're not trying to tell the whole story in your words, to put it another way. As much as you can communicate through the visuals, even that's better. So make the most of it being a video. There's no point otherwise. You make it a podcast, make it an audio only format. If you want to make it like that, it could be an audio book or whatever. And if you're going to go to the effort of filming animals, then make sure they are also telling the story you want to tell.
Great, thanks, Elliot. Nivedita Singh asks, what equipment do you use for this photography?
I'll get to that later. Hold that one.
Okay, perfect. Pedro Shiu asks, how do you strike the balance between highlighting the complex and nuanced issues behind environmental challenges and making snappy, simple, enjoyable content?
Well, the key thing there is firstly be aware of audience. Secondly, be aware of the platform, the content type you're using. So if it is going to be a 40-minute documentary that streams on Netflix, that's very different to like a 2-minute YouTube video. And I mean, I've done both formats. They're very different. If you're trying to do a 2-minute YouTube video, you need to grab someone within the first 8 seconds. That's been scientifically proven. You definitely need to make it sharp and snappy, ideally quite humorous, tending towards that lighter tone. If you're making a longer form documentary, you can afford more leeways. So you can go briefly into some of the environmental impacts we're having. We certainly show those, which has been one of the most widespread criticisms of wildlife filmmaking, that it only shows a pristine environment. So making sure you show both sides of the story. But when you are doing that, keep in mind the structure. So, I mean, take Harry Potter, for example, the books or the movies. What they try and do, and what J.K. Rowling was an expert at, was juxtaposing plot that's quite dark with light-hearted moments and triumphs, like a Quidditch match. So if you're going to have a dark message, make sure you sandwich it between some lighter content, and make sure you're having that black, white sort of progression, on, off, light, dark, whatever it may be. But do that so that people don't just switch off. The issues come when you just stick with a really pessimistic outlook for, say, 5 minutes. Then people are just going to switch off. They're not going to bother watching. They don't want to be told off. You're not their mother, you're not their parents. So if you're trying to deliver a message, deliver it subtly, but also disguise it, if you will, in that light-hearted sandwich. So make sure you get that structure right. It's like when you have, say, even a conversation with someone, and you're trying to give them a constructive criticism. What you would typically do is you'd start with small talk, and then you'd have some sort of compliment, make them feel good, get them nice and relaxed. Then you'd drop the bombshell. Then you'd try and steer it back onto a more light-hearted path. So just like it's a conversation with the viewer, that's how you're trying to frame a message.
That's great advice. Thank you, Elliot. Sarah Baudelaire asks, how do you balance between having people empathize with issues and desensitizing your audience, like you mentioned? What advice would you have?
Same answer as the last question.
Okay, awesome. And Marine Bengali says, how do you consider the environmental impacts of your filming practice?
Really good question. So there are two sorts of environmental impacts. The one being the indirect. So, I mean, that's fairly obvious. If you're flying to India, then you should ideally be carbon offsetting. You should be trying to minimize your indirect impact on the planet via whatever activities you're doing, whether it's flying to an exotic location, whether it's discarding unwanted electronic equipment, making sure you're doing so responsibly, or ideally repurposing it or recycling it. So when it's an indirect impact, that's something you can generally work around. The more controversial and the more challenging ones to consider in terms of the impacts you're having are the direct ones. So that's when we go into the ethics of wildlife filmmaking, shooting. So one really common sort of spark point is filming nesting birds. So there are quite a number of species where if the parent couple of birds who are currently raising chicks are disturbed in that nesting process, then they will simply abandon the nest, abandon the chicks, and the chicks may die. So you have to be really careful in that case. And that's where research pays off, knowing your subject matter, knowing your species. So every wildlife film crew will have some sort of researcher, some sort of scientific advisor, expertise who knows the animals. That's step one. But also being very aware in the moment itself. So an animal's body language, as I've said, can tell you so much. It's like reading a person. It's like having a conversation with them almost. When I'm presenting, when I'm speaking to someone, then 95%, I believe, of what I'm saying, as the science shows, is communicated via my body language. That's what you're focusing on, less so my words. So you can ignore the 5% of what I'm saying, but focus on that 95% for other animals. And for example, if in that case where I was filming with Wild Earth TV in South Africa, one of the really common subjects we came across was elephants. Elephants obviously can kill you. They don't do so maliciously. They do so if you anger them. They do so if you disturb or frighten them. So there are definitely signs to look out for when you have an adult male elephant, a bull elephant, who's in season, ready to mate. It's called in must. Then you can see that in the elephant. You can see that in the way it behaves. You can see that in some of the fluid in their large ears. So being aware of signs like that and being conscious of their body behavior. So the much quoted wisdom with elephants is when they're charging you, how to tell if it's a mock charge or not. So the trick is whether they're flapping their ears. Really simple things like that can tell you so much. So knowing the animal and observing them in the moment and planning ahead, obviously. So showing respect. Cool. Well, we've definitely hit the next hour, so I'll power on. Keep the questions coming if anything arises. But this is the part where we walk the walk, so to speak. And there's an elephant for you. Very fortuitous. Okay. So yeah, I briefly mentioned when we were doing those questions about how you can have a film that doesn't have any spoken word at all. And this is an unusual example. It's a trailer, like a reel, as it would be called, for a podcast show I run called Human Nature. And I mean, I include it mostly as a recap of what we've covered in the past hour, but take note of it, especially focus on the quotes and consider what they're saying, because we definitely need to carry with that with us moving forward as we approach the logistical side of things. That's so close. We almost got there without it breaking up. But yeah, that's a great example of a really simple video you can do. That doesn't have any filming on location. It doesn't have any people you're talking to. All it's intended to do is have some dramatic music, perk an audience's interest, and get them thinking about relevant topics. So that's what quotes are made for, really. And yes, some really interesting ones in there to keep in mind. So onwards and upwards, as they say. But the first point to touch base on when we're talking about the logistics of filmmaking is how bloody difficult it can be. So these are just a few examples from Attenborough and from some of the BBC's works, mostly. If we go sort of clockwise round, there's probably the most famous Attenborough moment saying boo to a sloth. The point being, if it's any other animal than a sloth, it can be really difficult to gain an animal's trust to get close to it. And in spite of the invention of long telephoto lenses and brilliant zooms, you still do need to get very close to animals to produce a film. So this is actually where the conversation during the break about ethics comes in as well, because if you are being respectful towards an animal, if you're taking things very slowly and gaining its trust, then that is by far and away the best way to approach filming it. And also being fully prepared to back out when the animal suggests it's appropriate to do so, when it shows signs of distress, if it's at all uncomfortable, then that's definitely your responsibility as the filmmaker to do so. So, I mean, in early Attenborough work, you get things like him riding an elephant, which would definitely be frowned upon today. But times change, and making sure you're aware of that and of the way work may be perceived as well. So that could be really important. And I mean, if you move on to the cheetah, that's a hunt scene, as you can probably tell, or a clip from it. The point being that cheetahs, like snow leopards, like a few different animals, are essentially a holy grail of wildlife filmmaking. They are like a trophy, which you can put up in a show reel as a production company to show that you mean business, because it is devilishly hard to film a cheetah hunt scene. You have to be tracking it in a forward drive vehicle alongside the cheetah. You have to have immaculate camera work to keep that cheetah in frame. So there is a lot of high-end technology and a lot of incredibly skillful people that can go into productions. That's not necessarily the only way to do things, and we'll go into this more. But be aware, it's not easy. Definitely, I would never say that it's an easy line of work trying to create a film, but it's well worth it. So keep that in mind and be aware of subject matter. Some animals will be incredibly easy to film, i.e. a sloth. Some animals won't be. So never underestimate the challenges of the shoot. And some simply don't pan out. You get crews going out to Tanzania to film lions hunting elephants and simply not seeing that behavior happening, which is one of the big flaws in the current production model. But yeah, being prepared for any eventuality, being adaptable, and being savvy about the animals you're trying to film is takeaway. Moving swiftly on, actually I won't go into the albatross chick too much because we talked about that in the break from the ethical standpoint. But yeah, the crucial point being that as wildlife filmmaker, you have a responsibility towards the animal and towards the viewer as well, that you do the right thing for both of them. So there have been various controversies on that point. Famously, in the filming of, I believe it was Frozen Planet, there was a young penguin chick that was going to die, and that was saved by the film crew, sparking all sorts of arguments. Should they save it? Should they not? I personally fall down on the side of they should have. But whenever you are intervening, it has to be done with the right perspective in mind. So you're not doing it for personal gratification. You're doing it because it's the right thing by the animals and by the greater good of that environment. So you're not interfering, for example, in a cheetah hunt, which is perfectly natural, even if it is traumatic. Okay, moving again, we'll go down on the right and see there's a plant growing in a lovely time lapse. I believe that's actually from Africa, the documentary, as opposed to Private Life of Plants, but point stands for either of those productions filming things that move incredibly slowly is also incredibly difficult, and they had to invent new technologies to do so. So again, be wary of subject matter, but also be curious about how a new perspective can be taken via filmmaking. When you're creating a film, what you're showing is not necessarily true to life. It doesn't have to be what you're seeing through your own eyes. You're creating a narrative via what you've filmed. So if you speed it up 2,000 times, and you do so for the right reasons, to show plant behavior in this case, then that can be incredibly empowering. And plants, I will have no irks admitting, are incredibly difficult to empathize with. So in this case, a filmmaking medium can be an unparalleled tool to make people care about botany, about conserving plants, which are just as important as animals. The two in the middle, as you can see, are part of the same sequence. It is probably one of the most famous sequences, again, from recent wildlife film history. You may recognize it. It's a hunt scene where you have an iguana hatchling running away from, I believe, garter snakes. And what it's trying to do is reach the rocks of the iguana colony from where it was, where it dug itself out of a burrow in the sand. And it has to run past all of these snakes, and it's an incredibly tense scene, and it sparked an incredible international controversy when members of the public realized that this was not all shot in one continuous sequence of the same iguana running this gauntlet. Most people thought it was immoral in that you could trick an audience that way and make them think, as it was presented to them, that you've got this iguana that almost got strangled by a snake, then just escaped another snake, then XYZ. Is an incredible scene. But that, in fact, that was, say, half a dozen iguanas. So wherever you may stand on a controversy like that, the point is, as a filmmaker, your responsibility is also to the audience. So all you're trying to do in the end is show natural events as they would happen. That doesn't have to be in the same take. I believe many of those controversies were unwarranted, but being forthright about that is important as well. So not trying to disguise a fact like that. It's very often the case that you can't have, as would be necessary to film a sequence like that in one take, say a dozen cameras planted throughout that beach, knowing just where that iguana would run, to get all those lovely close-ups, that snake strangling it, that snake chasing after it with a moving camera. Would be impossible to do in one take. So you have to create a narrative from what you have, but making sure that narrative is true to life is your responsibility. And that's not always easy. So it's frequently the case in productions. If you look carefully, say at a hunt scene, you may not see the animal actually being taken down. It will cut between predator and prey, predator moving, apparently off screen, prey suddenly startled and running, but you have no way of knowing whether that was the same incident, whether it was even the same predator that caused the prey to be spooked. What they've done is piece these two perhaps entirely different events together into a single sequence that to the viewer seems like it's a hunt scene taking place. And that's fine. But as much as possible, try and be true to life. And the last one is fairly obvious, if hilarious, frog jumping onto Attila's face. Being a simple point that animals, as I mentioned, don't follow scripts. They certainly don't act on cue. So being flexible is critical when we're creating any sort of narrative. And I personally am of the school of thought that you film An ecosystem, you film an animal as it presents itself and then create the narrative, as opposed to imposing a narrative upon the animal, which is traditionally the norm. So trying to create a narrative out of simply filming an animal's day-to-day life has been done a few times. If you know the Dynasties series was another BBC production, again with an actor voiceover that did just that. So it followed several animals, chimpanzees, wild dogs, lions, for several years and crafted their narrative without trying to impose a narrative on them. As a result, you get much, much more dramatic events taking place that were entirely unscripted, that actually happened to these animals. They weren't made up as a fake hunt scene, but that are very moving nonetheless. So some things to keep in mind. So we'll whiz on. And if you take anything away from this presentation, please, please, please try and remember this. This is your key to using any sort of camera. And I'm a personal advocate for the phone. I mentioned earlier that 2/3 of people have one. It has, in especially newer models, brilliant cameras that rival any big black shiny BBC production camera you can talk of. It will shoot in 4K footage in many cases if you tweak the settings. So a phone can do miracles, but even that requires understanding this. What this is it's called the exposure triangle. When you're creating a film or a photograph, you're playing with light. That's a limited resource. So you're splitting it essentially between these three things. Shutter speed is the most obvious. Say when you're taking a photograph, the shutter speed is how fast the camera is taking that in. So if you had a shutter speed of, say, 1 second, for simplicity's sake, that means the sensor, the light sensor on your camera, is taking in all the light that it receives in that 1 second. So if it's a cheetah running, then it's going to be very blurry, your photograph, because you've got the light from when it was at the start and it's at the end, which could be 10, 100 meters on. So bear that in mind. What you've got when you've got aperture is how large a hole you're giving the light to come through and to hit the sensor. So if you have an aperture, which they're always given as a fraction. So if I had an aperture of 32, that means the hole that the light is coming through is 1/32 in terms of the size it is. If I had an aperture of 4, it's the 1/4 size. That's much larger. When I have an aperture that is larger, that means I've got a shallow depth of field. So in the case of my cheetah hunt scene, you're going to have the cheetah being very much in focus, tacky sharp, and the background will be blurred out. That's a beautiful cinematic look. So lots of documentaries you'll see when it's close up on an animal, that would be with an aperture like an f4. Whereas if it's a landscape where you want to see the beautiful grass in the foreground and Mount Kilimanjaro in the background, then you want an aperture like 32 or more to be able to keep all of that in focus. And the last one is the ISO. So the ISO is essentially controlling the camera sensor's sensitivity to light. So if you're making the camera sensor, telling it